Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Timotheus Pope, and I am the director of Summer's Best 2 Weeks Citikidz. It's a Christian sports camp in southwestern Pennsylvania that services urban students. I am here with my good friend and our director of kaleos. Kaleos is a Greek word that means invited, and we define that here as called, connected, and committed. He leads those leaders from the city who help us do our job in changing the city from the inside out instead of trying to do it from the outside in. Alan is a graduate of James Madison University. He loves political science. He has a master's in public administration. And we were asked to do a series seminar class on redemptive ethnic unity. And so we are calling this class Body Talks. We are talking specifically about why diversity and multiculturalism, multi-generationalism is important for the body today. And we are in Bible study together in the book of Ephesians. We were looking through Ephesians chapter 3 yesterday. We were talking about how God puts Jew and Gentiles together. When God reconciles us to himself, he reconciles us as well to one another. Paul was speaking in the context of Jew and Gentile, but the reality that Paul really wants us to get is that if you name the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, you are in relationship with him, in relationship with others. And therefore, regardless of what they look like, he uses his manifold wisdom to flex. And so that said, we were sent a list of questions, and we thought the best way to do this is on video, answer the questions as honestly, openly, and transparently as we can, but also as biblically and as historically accurate as we can. So, Alan, welcome to Body Talks. Thank you for being here. Oh, let me do this too. Let me define redemptive ethnic unity for you. I know I just said when God reconciled us to himself, he reconciles us to one another, but really the idea of redemptive ethnic unity is that Ephesians chapter 1, Christ may be all in all. The reality is he redeems all things. And so I'm a big fan of scripture, as you well know. And so one of the things that immediately we're going to jump into in relation to answering these questions is how God builds his church. And church is not just the New Testament, Acts chapter 2, birthplace of the church idea. Jesus was talking about the church before that. The church is the people, but church is also the vehicle by which God is going to make his manifold wisdom known. That said, isn't it interesting that in Genesis chapter 11, they would be able to do anything, and they built the Tower of Babel. God confounds their languages. And in Acts chapter 2, he gives them the ability to speak in other languages and be understood by each other. What God does is really reverse Babel so that we can see God's redemptive ethnic unity and oneness in all things is what Jesus prayed in John 17. And so that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about people groups who move from place to place and how God chooses to redeem not just part of our lives, but every single piece and part of our lives. I'm going to go through these questions one by one, and we will answer them for you. Question number one, why is this topic of ethnic diversity important for a place that has so little diversity? This is specifically going to a church in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, that, there isn't a whole lot of ethnic diversity, but we're going to talk about diversity in general, and we'll answer this question. So, Alan, why is this topic of ethnic diversity important for a place like Somerset County, Pennsylvania, that has so little ethnic diversity?
Diversity is important in and of itself because, one, as a nation, we are a melting pot is often the word you hear, but we're a melting pot of different cultures.
Salad bar.
Salad bar.
Yeah.
We're a salad bar of different cultures, races, ethnicities. Diversity very often we think of as just diversity is just differences. It's not necessarily race.
Right.
It could be it's race, but it's diversity of thought, how you think, where you're from, how you grew up. So there's rural, there's a rural diversity, there's a urban diversity. So there's lots of different types of diversity. Racial and ethnic diversity is incredibly important, but also understanding just how to interact with people that are different from you.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times, even in church, there's diversity within churches where people come from different backgrounds.
Absolutely.
And understanding how to operate in that context is important because as a believer, it shouldn't matter whether I'm an American Christian or whether I'm a Chinese Christian or whether I'm in an African country or wherever, South African Christian, whatever. Right. I should be able to operate and understand each other no matter what our background is.
Right. Or if I'm a poor Christian or a rich Christian,
absolutely.
if I'm a a Christian from the rural context who's a farmer versus a Christian who's from a city context, and I work on Wall Street. Alan just referenced the 2042 projection, and I just want to tell you what that means. In 1965, there was the Immigration Reform Act. So what happened as a result of that is, years later, in 2011, over 50% of U.S. births were of non-European descent. So part of that is majority culture is going down in the birth rate, but then minority cultures are going up in the birth rate. Over 50% were minorities in 2011 in America. And so that being the case, 2016, as you can imagine, 5 years later, the kindergarten class was over 50% minority or of non-European descent. That means by 2023, all people between the ages of 10 and 18 are going to be of non-European descent. And then likely by 2042, that means all people in America, of all people in America, over 50% will be of non-European descent. And thus then the minority culture currently will become the majority culture. Never forget, words have roots. And that word diversity, the second part of it, comes from the same word where we get the word worth, where we get the word worship, where we get the word weird. And it's really the idea of something being different, something being exceptional, something being not like the norm. And so diversity is really the idea that something is not what everything else is. So if you keep that in mind as you go through thinking through this diversity piece, you won't just think of it in terms of race and class. You'll think of it in terms of any differences, as Ellen said.
And a point of diversity is that it does not mean less than. Very often when people think of diversity, they think I'm getting something lesser than in order to do something different. But it's literally just a difference.
Question number 2, what resources would you point a person to who is seeking to grow in this area of their lives?
I mean, there's a ton of them.
There are. And we will supply you with a list of resources. It's probably 4 pages long of resources that will help you understand this idea of diversity. And it really all depends on what kind of resource you're looking for. There are podcasts. There are hundreds of podcasts. There's a podcast called Code Switching, and you would be able to listen to that podcast. Michelle Alexander is another incredible author and speaker who wrote the book, The New Jim Crow. There is Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, the movie was just done about him. He's another speaker, has TED Talks. There are hundreds of thousands of resources. What I would say in the question is we generally find what we're looking for. And so if you're the type of person who only watches one news channel, for example, you're likely not going to get a lot of diversity there. I mean, you will get some, right, by nature of the definition of diversity, but you're probably not going to get the other side of the aisle or across the street or across the tracks perspective because you'll be somewhat limited to listening to a perspective that is more like yours, if that's the one that you're used to listening to most. And so there are tons of TED Talks. Danger of Having One Story is a great TED Talk. Another one that talks about Cheng Su Ra talks about that 2042 projection, and it's called Build a Dome Instead, where he's talking about how President Donald Trump wanted to build a wall. And he said, based upon birth rates, it would be better to build a dome. But the reality is, based upon birth rates, you're going to see an increase of minorities, not because of immigration, but because of the 1965 reformation of the Immigration Act. Question number 3, why is the topic of race important for a church like St. Paul specifically?
I can't speak to St. Paul's context specifically. Yeah. But I think, again, speaking to why race is important, very often you'll hear that phrase, I don't see color, and understanding the history of our country, you have to be able to recognize that there are differences and understand recognizing those differences doesn't mean that they're less than, but there are particular struggles that certain races of people have. And so if speaking in a biblical perspective, if I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, if what I've done for the least of these I've done for Jesus, not understanding what people of different races go through and how I can help them is not biblical. It's not living the gospel.
Right.
Because I think very often people think that, if I'm non-racist, therefore I'm living the gospel. But you can't just be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist.
Correct.
So you have to actually
stand
up for something, not just be agnostic about it.
Right, absolutely. I think even in reading that question, why is race important? I hear somebody asking, "Hey, why are roses important? We're all tulips, so why do we care about roses?" It's like, well, because roses smell just as sweet. They're a different type of flower. They're made completely differently, and as they're made completely differently, they can add a value to your experience that you currently do not have.
Yeah.
Because you're just living with daisies or tulips or whatever you might be, and so. Or it's like a person saying, I only see, when I look at the rainbow, I only see one color. It's like, well, you're missing out on all the richness, the exquisiteness of a rainbow. Here's another question. I love what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for, but from what I understand, his lifestyle was sexually immoral. How do I reconcile those two things? Is he worthy of the veneration we give him? Is there someone who could be a better representative for civil rights movement?
So
there's a lot to be said on this one. Let me just start with, there's a lot to be said on this one.
For sure. So I don't want to say I have an issue with the question.
You do. I have an issue with the question.
Yeah, and it's more so I have an issue with the thought behind the question, not the question itself.
Yeah.
So the thought behind the question is that because Martin Luther King Jr., for those that don't know, he had an affair, and so because he had a moral failing, now anything that he's done or said is now invalid. That's sort of what you get from the question. Which, if that's the case, then no one has the right to speak up about anything.
Correct.
If that's where we're going to take it. So that's sort of the pause that I have, is that because he had a moral failing, does that mean he's any less important? Doesn't mean what he said is not valid. Because again, I mean, even if you look at the Bible, David had a moral failing. Doesn't mean that he was not a king. It doesn't mean that he didn't do anything.
Doesn't mean he's not in the lineage of the Lord Jesus. Doesn't mean he didn't kill Goliath. No. It doesn't take away anything great that he did. It
cancel out anything great that he did. And again, it was the Lord, but it doesn't cancel out who he was. And so, as far as the topic is concerned, I would be careful when looking at someone's failing and then defining them by that, as opposed to anything else that they could have added to American culture, society, or the world, for that matter.
Absolutely. The hard part is that would be a slippery slope. I mean, you mentioned David. I think about Abraham. I think about Moses. I think about anybody through Scripture who had Samson. Like, Samson is then venerated, as this question says, in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Jephthah, who knows what he did with his daughter, whether he killed her or made her a perpetual virgin. Either way, what he says, I'm going to make it a burnt offering. Right. So, again, Jephthah is mentioned. Barak is mentioned. And so if you read your Bible, the reality is so many saints who had so many moral failings were held up by the Lord as images of people from whom we can learn, not because they were perfect. Right. And I think my issue, again, you said the thought behind the question, part of my issue with the question is there a better representative to look at for civil rights? Well, a couple of things. Number one, it should be called human rights, not civil rights, because it's a human right for me to be able to eat in the same restaurant as somebody who doesn't look like me. Right. But I understand that it's called civil rights for what we do. The second part of that is there a better representative? Well, yeah, Jesus would be the perfect representative. He said, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Who said it before him? Moses. Treat other people the way that you want to be treated. Guess what? Jesus is perfect, but Moses had moral failings. Right. So if that's who you're going to lean on to say, hey, here's a better role model, you just got to find somebody without moral failings. And so
it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. And the reality is, even people who have not failed sexually in the same way, that's the other issue I have. It seems like if it's sexually immoral, we need a better role model.
Right. Our founding fathers had slaves.
Absolutely. Founding fathers had slaves, said people weren't people. I mean, to me, again, if that's going to be the logic that we use, then to me, again, as you said, nobody is, and anybody that you then stamp and say that person's fine, I would tell anybody who would ask a question, you need to be really, really careful, because it sounds like there's a degree of sin to you, which there isn't to God. There also sounds like at some level that somebody has to be perfect or close to it, or at least not morally, sexually fail in order to be found as somebody to listen to or to venerate as a saint. Peter denies Jesus, and people will say, yeah, but he got it right after that. Did he? Is that why Paul had to confront him to the face in the book of Galatians? Because Paul says, you're offending the gospel. Right. So anybody who would offend the gospel, that same thing would be true.
Also, there were multiple civil rights leaders, so Andrew Young, there's John Lewis, there are tons of them. James Farmer, but Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered.
Absolutely.
So, that's sort of why, he was a martyr for his cause. So that's another reason why he's held up, because he cared so deeply about something and then had his life cut short.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. How do white people refer to black people in a way that is most respectful / the way they want to be referred to? Black, African American, is it best to ask them? Is there a consensus on this?
That's a great question. It's always best to ask. One, because you're considering someone that is different than you. So that's always helpful. Because personally, I like black over African American. I have an issue with the term African American. It's because it is to otherize people. Because I'm just as American as anyone else. But then they then say African. Another issue is that African is a continent, and where some people will say, well, my family's from Germany, so I'm German American or I'm Italian American. Well, those are actual countries, as opposed to just saying I'm lumped in with a whole country of people that have different cultures and ethnicities within them.
Absolutely.
So,
which shows the social and cultural bias.
Yes.
Of even the term. And people will go, yeah, but that term, even Jesse Jackson created the Afro-American term. Who created it is less relevant than what it means. The thing that always bothers me with that is two things. Number one, I can trace white and Native American history in my family almost easier than African. Right. B, what do you do with people who are Dutch from South Africa who are white skinned?
Yes.
And when they come to America, are they African American? Because they would be from South Africa. Right. But again, we would lump them into white. And so it shows even the structure of race in America was not created from those who were different, right? What we categorize the difference. We don't categorize the normal. We've talked about this many times, and we'll probably get into this later. When it's extortion, we just say crime. But then there's this thing called black on black crime, which again, as I share with many brothers and sisters, often somebody say, yeah, the black church in such and such, but when they're talking about a church that's not a minority church, they'll just say church. And so again, I think what we pull out of this question is two things. Treat other people the way that you want to be treated. I think it's what we're going to continue to say in body talks. But I think the other thing we pull out is there are so many things that we're asking about that if you look at them on a scale, the question is here. The creation of that question was already flawed. So it would be like if I walked up to Alan and said, hey, do you still steal from the store? If I started with that question, that presupposes that he stole from the store and that he enjoyed stealing from the store and continues to steal from the store. So maybe even in the question, I first need to take a step back and go, well, wait, why is that even my question? And where did that come from? Because I think asking those questions will also help us be culturally intelligent with those who are different than us. And that's not just race, that's socioeconomic status. I don't think you can walk up to somebody and say, hey, would you like to be called rich or wealthy? You want to be poor or broke? I don't think that's the way to handle that. I think what we do is see people as people. And then as we see them as people, it's really missionaries and mission fields, people that need the gospel or people that already have it. Also, the question, is there a consensus on this? I think it's just helpful to let people know there is not a, just like there isn't for any other, I don't know that there's a convention where people who are diverse get together and go, hey, listen, this is what we're going to call this, or this is how we go. Right. No, the reality is what generally happens is as the world changes, there are embracing of terms and rejection of terms. Right. And so we want to make sure, again, people are understanding, and we know, you may not know what you don't know. That's why we're here. That's why we're having a conversation.
And we don't speak for all black people.
And we don't, absolutely. We don't speak for all black people. This is not that convention. This is not that. What we want to do is try to help provide some insight just from a different perspective that might be helpful for people engaging people who are different than them. How do you know if you're racist? How do we rightly think about that label, that sin? How might I be a racist and not even be aware that I'm racist? How does a white person seek Holy Spirit conviction about this sin? So we'll start with, how do you know if you are racist?
Right. So
a racist.
Yes. So in understanding if you're a racist, you first have to define what racism is, right? So racism is a system of oppression in which you are basically making people less than, and you have people that have more than and people that have less than, and you're then pushing that system. So the way in which you are and it tends to be based on race, right? And race is your skin color. And so if you are then racist, you are now perpetuating that system that disadvantages people based on race. That makes sense?
Absolutely.
So that's how you would know. If you're okay with pushing systems that disadvantage people based on the color of their skin, then you're probably a racist.
Yeah. And let me say, if you're pushing them, I love how you say it, not just a non-racist, but an anti-racist.
Yes.
If you're not pushing them, but you're not pushing against them,
right?
You can find yourself acting in what I'm gonna call a racist way, or perpetuating racist ideas. That is taken directly from Ibram Kendi, who wrote a book called Stamped from the Beginning. That the real premise of the book is that what happens is we think that racist people have racist ideas, and then they employ those racist ideas to keep and suppress a people group. When in actuality, what often is the case is the producers of racist ideas, it's advantageous for them to produce an idea that helps them stay in power. Example, if I'm a white slave owner in the 1800s, I may be okay with black people, but I'm not okay with losing my bottom line. So I might perpetuate that black people are not a people in order to continue to be a slave owner and make money off of slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. Let me also say this because I think it's important. Definitions are huge, and I think what we're going to spend just a few minutes doing is defining the categories for you to kind of help you understand where you might fit. So I'm going to start with ethnicity. Remember, we're talking about redemptive ethnic unity. So that's the Greek word ethnos. It means group of people. It's really the idea that there are groups of people who live together, who work together. That is ethnos, and what we mean by ethnicity. The second one is culture. And culture is a way of life. Ethnicity can be seen very simple as where we come from. Culture is a way of life. It can be seen as the way we do things around here. And so what is culture for us here at Summer's Best 2 Weeks may not be culture everywhere else. The next part of understanding that culture is helpful to start thinking through in your own life how we do things around here. This gets a little bit at the question, how might I be a racist and I not even know it? Start asking yourselves questions like, hey, who do I want my daughter to marry and why?
Right.
Because the question may come down, as Brian LaRich said, not to can you be my brother in Christ if you're different, but can you be my brother-in-law? Can you be my son-in-law? If you begin to start wrestling with questions like, hey, who do I want my children hanging out with? If you see somebody who looks different than you and you immediately have thoughts about them or where they came from or what their life is like, it is very possible that you are beginning to think in a racist way. But let me get down to racism. So ethnicity is a group of people, where we come from. Culture is a way of life, how we do things around here. But then there often arises a majority culture. And based upon that majority culture, what is created is called privilege. You might know in America, white privilege. And the idea there is, if you don't have to think about it, it's privilege. I'll tell you what, here's a great example, and Alan's going to help me with this example, and I hope that it blesses you and ministers to you. I happen to be right-handed. Alan, what are you?
I'm left-handed.
Alan, tell us about being left-handed.
So being left-handed there are a lot of difficulties that I go through in life just simply being left-handed. Scissors. If anybody's ever used scissors, they are made for people that are right-handed. Notebooks, writing in a notebook or in a binder, in a 3-ring binder. I write with my left hand, so that binder normally stops me from writing. So I had to change the way I write. I actually turn my page or my notebook and write up the page so I don't have to worry about messing my arm up on the binder. Another thing is how even our culture, in American culture, how we read left or right. Very often when I write, my hand tends to smudge what I'm writing. And that's just because I'm left-handed. It's nothing that I did to be left-handed. I was just born this way, but it completely changes the context of how I have to live because I'm left-handed.
So I had this experience. We do a lot of work here on computers. And so Alan's computer is set up left-handed. So his mouse is set up left-handed, not right-handed. And so I sit down at his computer and I start doing work, and I'm working with his mouse. But what am I doing? I'm working right-handed. Well, instead of me thinking, oh, this is an opportunity for me to adjust and maybe I need to learn to use my left hand. Instead, I went, Alan's dumb computer. Why does he have to have it set up left-handed? It was an immediate recognition. Oh, man, that's privilege for me. Because I'm used to doing right-handed stuff. Most of the people I know are right-handed, and I live in a right-handed world. And what I did is I really set apart the difference as being left-handed. Notice, we don't walk up to people and say, hey, you're right-handed. We walk up to people and say, hey, you're left-handed. Because we know right-handed to be normal. If you don't have to think about it, it's privilege. What privilege often leads to, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, because we do label the variant and not label what we normalize, that leads to prejudice. Prejudice literally just means prejudging by thoughts. We have to. You don't know everything beforehand, and so at some level, and there are people who will argue with me and say, there's a difference between prejudice and discernment. Prejudice always has a negative connotation. I understand what they're saying. I'm just simply saying the word by definition means prejudged thoughts. So to call somebody beautiful or to say you got a beautiful name, well, that's a thought that is prejudged because you don't know anything. But I can judge somebody as smart before I ever really know them just based upon seeing them do something. I can watch Shark Tank and say, man, they're really kind. I don't even know them, but I prejudge them. Prejudgments can be good too, but they don't always have to be negative.
And more often than not, they should not be negative. And the ones that we have as it pertains to race tend to be baited or they tend to be based in past racist ideas or practices that we do not recognize. So the idea that African Americans are more violent, that we're more sexually crazed, that we're lazy or anything like that, as opposed to any other race, a lot of that comes from, there was a book called, there was a movie called The Birth of a Nation that was in, I think, 1918. And it was basically a racist propaganda because it was shortly after, shortly after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era. There was a movie that was basically a huge propaganda film, and it was one of the largest grossing films in America. But what they did was they portrayed African Americans as savages. They portrayed African Americans as rapists and murderers. They actually had the KKK as heroes in the film. But what it did was it seared into the psyche of our nation that these freed slaves are now, they're different and they're dangerous, that they're savages, they're rapists, they're murderers, they're lazy. And so now we have those same prejudgments that were based in a racist idea from 1918 that we still see today. That when you immediately think of Black people, well, the reason why Black people are poor is because they don't work hard. No, some of it is there are systems in place that have hurt them. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about white flight and things like that. But there are systems in place that have economically disadvantaged them, and that's why they're poor. It has nothing to do with them as people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then what people forget is my prejudice can often, because it came from grandma and granddad and daddy, I don't want to let it go.
Right.
And so what happens is my ethnicity that has given me a culture, a certain way of life. If I'm that majority culture, I'm in privilege. If I'm in privilege, I'm having the time of my life. And I've been handed down privilege. I don't want to let that go. And you know what we call that? We call that bigotry. When you have an attachment to a creed, when you don't want to let it go because you recognize, hey, this is good for me, it begins to fuel intolerance for things that are different than you because they begin to threaten your privilege. From bigotry, what tends to happen is then discrimination. I begin to act based upon my bigoted or prejudged ideas. So because I think somebody's lazy or because I think they're dangerous, I'm going to treat them that way.
Right.
It's basically guilty until proven innocent. I'm going to treat them that way, discrimination, until I don't have a reason to treat them that way. That then leads to this system of oppression whereby I make rules that help keep my privilege in place. And so again, if you are not adamantly fighting against those, or you are actually perpetuating and pushing those forward, you would find yourself perpetuating racist ideas and or being racist, acting in a racist way, however you want to describe it. That is a way to think through whether or not, how you might know, how you might qualify whether or not you perpetuate racist ideas.
Yeah, and a lot of it, again, going back to the history of the nation, slaves arrived in America in Jamestown in 1619. So the earliest slaves were here in 1619. They were kidnapped from Angola. And they were slaves, they were African slaves that were also Angolan slaves from the continent of Africa that were but they were also indentured servants. And so a lot of these indentured servants were white. Well, people don't recognize that indentured servants is a form of slavery in which I owe a debt, and then in order to work off, and then I'm basically working for you in order to work off that debt. And so a lot of these ideas came from, so there were white people that were indentured servants, and there were also slaves. But what tended to happen was these black slaves and these white indentured servants tended to have a lot more in common than the rich white slave owners, because they own land. They tended to have more political power and things like that. And so what tended to happen was they started to make these differences between the two. So it was, well, the reason you don't have is because of that freed slave later on, is because of that freed slave and et cetera. And so they ended up having they made a grievance between the two. So that was a lot of what the Birth of a Nation was about. It was to tell these poor white people that the reason you don't have, or the reason there are all of these things, is because of these other races of people that are taking your
piece of the pie.
They're taking your piece of the pie. Absolutely.
There's another part of this question. How does a white person seek Holy Spirit conviction about this sin? And I think this is one of those times where it's really important to say, anybody who is in the majority culture position, remember, culture is the way we do things around here. If you're the majority running that position, setting up that system of oppression and causing it to thrive and run, you would need to wrestle with that. Like Jesus says, the Gentiles, they have power and they lord it over people. But the person who's going to be first among you must be your servant. And so I think if we think in terms of the idea that we have to do something special in order for the Holy Spirit to convict us of this particular sin, I'm not saying that somebody's saying that, but I almost hear that in the question. It's just like anything else. I mean, if you don't know that you're doing something wrong, as you seek the Lord, you begin to ask, hey, why do I say that? Why do I do that? I often share two stories. One, I grew up, only two Asians I knew up until I was age 18. Two boys, twins, I think they were adopted. We called them the Dragon Twins. I had no clue how racist that was until I grew up and got out of my community. Then I understood, oh man, the reason I did that is because I grew up watching all of these Kung Fu movies, and the only thing I knew about China was dragons. And so I associated these two boys with that. I did the same thing with two South American girls who were in my home who had just come from Colombia, and they told me they brought me something. And because I grew up watching Walker, Texas Ranger, and they were running drugs from Colombia all the time, I said, hey, you didn't bring me drugs, did you? And I started laughing. And then I was like, I'm sorry, ladies, that was completely wrong. But I knew it was wrong when I said it because, again, I wouldn't want anybody to treat me that way. I immediately recognized by asking myself the question, where did I get that from? And why do I think that that's acceptable? And there are many people who will use words and terms that they don't even know what they mean or where they came from. But if you just slow down and start asking, hey, why do I think that? Why do I have that belief? What am I consuming? Right. Like when I look at the last 6 channels that I watched, when I look at the newspaper that I read, when I look at the people I listen to on podcasts, when I listen to the preachers that I listen to, where do I see diversity? There's this exercise that I heard about, and I don't know how true it is, but when a family that is goes to adopt a child and that child is a different culture, my understanding is they put the family from a different culture in a room and they basically say, hey, tell us the last 6 television shows you watched, tell us the last 6 books you read. And for every author that is the same race or ethnicity or culture as you, I want you to drop in a marble that looks like you. And so let's say I have a white marble and I'm adopting a Asian child. They'll give me some other color marble. And so what I do is I drop all of them in, and then I drop the marble from this child in, and I look and see what the influences are in my life to see, am I in any way close? You know, for somebody to say, hey, what resources are out there? I mean, there are so many resources that talk about diversity and multiculturalism. But if I'm going to be honest with you, not all of them are Christian, right? Beyond that, a lot of them that are even Christian don't address it from a biblical perspective or don't address it from a historical perspective. But there are some good ones out there that do, as we continue to wrestle through what does this look like practically day to day, particularly in a church that already has a lot more people that are majority culture. Let's move to the next question. I don't know how to feel about Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, etc. On one hand, I heartily agree with both, but on the other hand, all lives do matter, and I wonder if it's helpful to make these distinctions. Do you have any advice about how to think about these issues?
Sure. The Black Lives Matter movement, it's about police brutality, and not only police brutality, that's one of the larger issues, but it's more about systemic racism. So they talk about it in the prison, in the preschool to prison pipeline system, which you see in schools.
Talk about that for just a second. For people who don't know what the prison to pipeline, the pipeline to prison is, will you tell people what that is?
So the preschool to prison pipeline is that more often what you see is in schools where the majority of the students are, so they're majority minority, so schools where over 50% of their students are African American or Hispanic, and even in schools where that's not the case, that those minority students tend to be treated differently. They tend to be suspended more for smaller offenses. They tend to have more in-school suspension. They tend to be expelled from school at a higher rate for some of the same sort of infractions that you may see in white schools. And so basically they're almost training those students up to then be in a prison system. And so you see that in elementary schools. And so that's sort of what they address systemic racism as a whole. They talk about redlining, everything.
Can you tell people what redlining is?
Sure. So
let me add one more to those pipelines. So prisons at one point were built based upon 3rd grade test scores because the thought was, hey, if these people aren't making it by then, they'll likely end up in our system. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, redlining. So redlining goes back to, and we can talk about this more because I think I read ahead some of the questions. It goes to white flight. What happened? So after World War II, there was the GI Bill, and what the GI Bill did was it provided funds for individuals returning from war to go to college, to start businesses, and to build houses. And so what happened was the access to those funds were not the same for African Americans because banks would not loan to Black people. At that time, again, we're talking about the 40s and the 50s, Black people were not allowed to go to colleges and universities. And again, so they can't get loans for mortgages, they can't get loans for businesses, and then they can't get money to go to school. Because the way the GI Bill works is it's on a reimbursement basis. So I get the loan from the bank, and then kind of like how they're doing now with the coronavirus, where you get a loan from the bank, but it's backed by the government if there's certain requirements are met. Well, Black people were not getting these loans. What ends up happening is it leads to something called white flight. It's right after World War II. There are these suburbs that pop up. They're called I think they were Levitt towns back then. It was one of the architects that was building them. And again, they were keeping Black people out, and you couldn't get a loan. So then white people then leave the city, and when they left the city, They built these suburbs with money back from the government through the GI Bill. They also start businesses, and they go to colleges. So then black people are left in the city where they have lower wages and lower jobs. And then what tends to happen is banks then draw lines around these communities not to loan to. So the idea of redlining is now you've put African Americans who are poor. We're going to say that they're more risky to loan to, and we'll basically draw lines around these communities. And most of these communities tend to be black and brown people, so they tend to be Hispanic or Latino and African American. So Black Lives Matter is more than about police brutality. It's about systemic racism. It's systemic oppression. The issue with the Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, is that very often the word that they change is black because it makes people uncomfortable. And again, there's this idea that they don't see race, but if you're not going to see race, you're not going to truly understand the struggles that someone else goes through.
Right.
And so and very often, like, Blue Lives Matter is about police officers. Well, a cop that's an occupation. That's something that you choose to do. Black Lives Matter also with the response of All Lives Matter. It is not that they are saying that Black Lives matter only. They're saying that Black Lives Matter too. And I think there's a question that talks about the idea about shootings and things like that. But when you talk about a lot of these shootings that happen with black people, very often the question is he was committing a crime, so therefore he got shot. What's the big deal? In a system that is fair, he has the same rights afforded to him by the Constitution as everybody else. So whether he committed a crime or not should not be what is talked about. It is the fact that he lost his life at the hands of a police officer who was there to serve and protect, not to take his life. Especially when there are things like selling cigarettes, like Eric Garner. Philando Castile was pulled over for a traffic stop, and he was shot and murdered. Tamir Rice was playing. He was playing in a park. He was a little boy playing in a park with a toy gun and got shot and murdered. Trayvon Martin, I think, was one of the questions. Again, he was walking down the street and it wasn't even shot by a police officer. Tatyana Johnson is another one. She was in her house with watching over either her nephew or her cousin, and a police officer shot through the window without even announcing that he's there. So there are those types of issues where they're saying that her life mattered. Whether she was a criminal or not, we all have the same rights afforded to us by the Constitution.
Absolutely. And that goes for the fact that, give you an example of systemic racism and oppression, the way that it works. Botham Jean is shot in his home by a white female police officer. And the first question is not, why did she shoot him? The first question is, what did he do? Right. There's this presupposition that the minority individual did something. However, the Boston bomber is taken alive.
Yes.
And so
the Aurora, Colorado.
Absolutely.
The Florida Parkland shooter. All of these shooters are taken into custody that are massive shootings that are perpetrating violence, actual violent crimes, yet there are hordes of black people that are being murdered for, Mike Brown stole from a convenience store. And I'm not saying that that's okay. The issue is, did he deserve to lose his life over it, especially in a system where there are terrorists, there are mass shooters that are being taken alive.
And or you can watch police cams where there are, and you can just type this into YouTube and you can see countless families who are of European descent who cursed police officers, who hit police officers. One actually that I was watching actually pushed a police officer, got in his car, drove it around, and they couldn't get to him. There were many times where their gun wasn't even drawn. Yet you can watch, unfortunately, routinely on YouTube, routine traffic stops where a police officer gets out of his car with his gun drawn, and you can see and hear on the body cam the things that are happening, and it's a clear indication that it's unfair.
And speaking back to some of these systems that have been set up, that maybe and some are racist, is again the idea of police to protect and serve, yet they're allowed to use violence when they are threatened. Well, if according to back to 1918, when the Birth of a Nation came out, if African Americans are then automatically seen as savages, as more violent, as more vicious than white, Hispanic, whatever, and that's not the case, well, now we're being proportionately murdered at a rate that is not the same for other races by police officers who again are there to protect and serve. So it is a system that has been created that then allows police officers to go into situations in which they now fear for their life because they see me as a threat, and I'm not, and we're not a threat to anyone.
Correct. And that's not every police officer, and that's not in every case.
Absolutely.
But we want to make sure that people understand. 2016, 963 people were killed by police. 360 of them were African American males. Did the third of people? The first question is, why are the police killing anybody if they're there to serve and protect? I recognize that happens at times, so I'm not saying anybody's wrong for what they did. As much as I'm saying that's a pretty high clip for it to be less than 1,000 people, and a third of those people, just over a third of those people, are one demographic and gender. That same thing would go for the prison system. The prison system is 75% African American and Hispanic. It doesn't make sense when those two minority populations together make up less than 20% of the American population. It doesn't make sense to me that they would be creating crimes at that much higher of a clip. Again, if you're listening to this and you're going, it makes sense to me, then you're perpetuating racist ideas. Because again, there are people who got put in prison in 1980 for a dime bag of marijuana that are still there. And now marijuana is legal in several states. And so you would think that there would be some form of reparation if we are truly seeking it, but I don't know if we are. And hey, you know, it started with Black Lives Matter, right? It didn't start with All Lives Matter. If that was the case, we never would have had to say Black Lives Matter. I mean, part of the reason we had to say it is because of getting killed at a higher clip by the people who are meant to serve and protect.
Yeah, there's a great analogy that I heard that I think is very helpful in understanding Black Lives Matter, what it means, the idea of the movement. It is, let's say if Timotheus and I are sitting at a table and we have a plate of food. Timotheus' plate does not have food. So Timotheus looks at me and says, hey man, T. Pope's food matters. If I respond to him, all food matters, well, that's true, but T. Pope is the one without food on his plate.
Right.
So that is the idea of Black Lives Matter. It is not saying that they're less than or greater than, it's saying that their lives matter too. And again, it would have been helpful had they just said Black Lives Matter too, or Black Lives Matter also, but that's not as catchy. So they just say Black Lives Matter. And again, whether or not, like, because they're not left or right, they're more about against systemic oppression. And so, and they have been usurped for political reasons, which is sad to see.
Next question. This is going to be a fun one, at least for us, I think. Isn't white privilege something that is less prevalent now than it was 30 years ago? If so, why does it seem to me such a bigger deal now than ever before in current racial relationships? Just want to remind you, it is 2020, so 30 years ago would have been 1990. You want to take that first? You want me to take that first?
You can go and
I'm happy to. 1990, what I'd love for you to do is just go and Google what athletes were being paid at that time. I've got a friend, 4-time Super Bowl champion, 2-time defensive MVP, who did not get paid near as much as his counterpart, Terry Bradshaw, for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who many of you love and know. The thing about white privilege, again, if you don't have to think about it, is privilege. And so when somebody says to me, hey, it's better now, or it's less prevalent now than it was 30 years ago, I don't know that it's less prevalent because, again, we had a president who is 50% white, 50% black, yet we called him a black president. I have biracial children. And to erase their mom and just say I was the one that existed doesn't make a lot of sense. But why does that exist? Well, there's this thing called the one-drop rule. Alan, would you like to talk more about the one-drop rule?
Sure. The one-drop rule was to, it was, again, a way to separate people. And so it was shortly after slavery because there was a lot of, how do I say it without sounding?
I think you just say what.
Yeah, so there were slave owners who were raping their slaves. And so they were having children with mixed blood. Because even I mean, I can tell you now, I'm a descendant of slaves, and I can guarantee you, if I took a DNA test, there would be European blood in my lineage, right? And so they were raped. My grandmother she passed away, but she could pass as a white person. She was incredibly fair skinned, and her hair was straight. And so there is and so because of this mixing of races, they wanted a way to differentiate between who was white and who was black. And so there was a sort of a rule that they went by, which was if you had one drop of black blood, you were therefore black. And it was a way that no matter what you look like, both your parents could be white, but if you had one drop of black blood, you were therefore seen as black, and then you were in that other category. It was a way to separate people. So that's the idea of the one drop rule.
Yeah. So then again, it would be like saying, hey, is being right-handed is not near as prevalent. I mean, talking about being right-handed, no, like that's where we are. I mean, that's why we label the variants. That's why we're having this conversation. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're gonna be honest, it costs many of you who hear this, it costs you nothing to hear this and to think about it. It really doesn't. At the end of the day, you can continue to live your life and never interact with somebody like me. Whereas it costs us everything. When we have these kind of conversations, we have to go back to every single place we've been hurt, every single place we weren't allowed at the table, every single time I had a conversation and somebody treated me differently than they treated my wife, for example. So it's amazing to me that we live here in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, and my wife, we now have 7 kids. My wife, I mean, they know us now. But when we first got here, my wife would walk through a particular store in town, and people would say, "Where did you get those kids from?" Because they just couldn't fathom with their brown skin that she was interracially married. And so it would be interesting the way that people would treat her when I'm not around and the way that people would treat her when I am around. And there are so many people who would say, "Oh, Timotheus, that doesn't exist anymore." And I'm just here to tell you, not only does it exist, it's very, very prevalent. The thing that you need to know, as Ibram Kendi points out in Stamped from the Beginning, just as multicultural ideas have grown and become more sophisticated, so have racist ideas. They've grown, they've become more sophisticated. It's a way that you can talk about things like, for years, urban equaled black because of white flight and all these other things. Well, now, when somebody says urban, they likely are talking about the corporate limits of a city because everything has changed. Upper Darby in Philadelphia used to be a completely suburban area. It's not anymore. But that's because white flight changes things, gentrification changes things. And so when you're not privy to these nuances of ethnicity, culture, and diversity, what can happen is you only have one side of the story. And that's incredibly dangerous if you only have one side of the story.
And the idea and a privilege, again, there are different types of privilege. My father, I grew up upper middle class. My father was an officer in the Navy. So I had a privilege being a military brat. I lived all over the world and all of that. So again, there are different kinds of privileges. There are some that are more harmful than others. And again, it's not to say that white privilege is a reason, like doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It means that your race is not one of those reasons, right? So there are certain issues that I will face just because of the color of my skin. There's nothing that I've done. There's nothing that we just talked about police brutality, but there are, and I think there's a question on what races, what times I may have faced racism in my life, but there are issues that I have come into contact with just because of the color of my skin. That if I were white, I would not, or more than likely would not have had to think about it. I can give you a couple of examples just about white privilege and things you don't think about. If you ever thought about Band-Aids, the color of Band-Aids are not meant for black skin. They were meant to hide. So if I'm more fair-skinned or white or European descent, I can wear a Band-Aid, and you more than likely won't be able to tell whether or not I have a Band-Aid. It's not the case if you're black and you're wearing a Band-Aid. So those are just sort of things that we think of in the privilege. The idea of there are states now that are actually passing laws where it is illegal to discriminate against black people for how their hair grows naturally out of their head, right? So there are laws that are passed that are saying it is okay for a black person to wear a natural hairstyle just for the way their hair grows out of their head. but being majority culture, you don't necessarily think about that because there's a degree to where you've never had to assimilate, or you don't have to assimilate, and so that privilege is not so much I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but there's nothing that you're doing to get that privilege. It's just the way that the system has been set up.
That's exactly right.
So it is not so much but you can't address the issue if you're not willing to actually call it out.
Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with me being left-handed. What happens is if I begin to treat Alan differently based upon him being left-handed and or tell him, no, dude, you just need to start acting more left-handed.
Right.
I would challenge you to do this very practically. If you're taking notes, start writing with your left hand. If you're left-handed, I mean, if you're right-handed, start writing with your left hand and try to take notes the rest of the time with your left hand. Unless you have practice, it's going to be extremely difficult, and you're probably going to at some point go, if not at the beginning, you go, no, that's stupid. I'm writing with my right hand, right? I don't have that choice. I can't just say, oh, well, I'm just going to be white today, or I'm just going to be Hispanic today. I'm going to be Asian today. I don't have that opportunity because of the color of my skin. And so please be reminded, privilege can be used for good things. I'm going to go ahead and be real. I don't recognize my privilege as a male.
Right.
You know, so they're really what we call a sociological gradient. There's the majority, the majority, the minority, and the minority. What it essentially means is the majority is the person who's the top of the food chain. They create culture by being the majority culture. Your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, aka WASP. Beyond that, then, there is the female version of that is the minority. At the end of the day, you're not going to be near as venerated or accepted as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, but you certainly are going to be more than the minority male or the minority female. And then there is the majority minority. And that person is a guy who is a guy of color. He's going to have all of the privileges of a male, but he's not going to have the privileges of that specific majority culture or race. The last one is what we call intersectionalism. Kim Crenshaw talks about intersectionalism in her TED Talk. And that's when you're a minority. That means you're a female of color. You can be discriminated against because of your color or because of your gender, but you're not sure which. And so there are many, many times where we don't even ask the question, how does your life experience work? And so again, unfortunately, instead of seeking to understand before seeking to be understood, what we basically do, most of us in life, is we just look through our own subjective experience and say, well, why don't you do this? Because that's what I do, instead of looking from that lens.
And this sort of also loops back to the importance of diversity. I cannot address an issue that I do not have experience with. And so if there aren't people in the room with other experiences, I will never be able to properly address or redress an issue that I've never experienced.
Interesting. Because if you think about what Alan just said, the U.S. Constitution was written with no minorities in the room and no women. So I would think if we really want to make change, at some level, we would push that envelope. Hey, should we at least revisit this with some minorities in the room? I don't know how many of you know this, but hanging was still legal until recently. Still legal until recently. And when I say recently, we looked it up. What was it? December,
Yeah,
I think. It's December of 2019 is when it was taken off the books.
Lynchings. Yeah.
Public lynchings. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something, that's super significant. And there are so many other things that are like that we don't even know are happening. Most of the time, we don't even ask the question. And we don't even feel like we need to. If you don't have to think about it, it's privilege.
And then just sort of, because and those privileges exist, and not being able are the historic. We're talking about them now because I think people are starting to understand the historical context of it. Again, if like the reason we have issues today goes all the way back to slavery, because there was slavery, but then right after slavery there was Jim Crow that lasted until, depending on historically, you could say 1968, because that was the last Civil Rights Act. So again, if you're thinking the final Civil Rights Act was in 1968. It was so that African Americans could not be discriminated against based upon you can't. It was housing discrimination, so I can live where I want to. That was in 1968. So then my sister is the first person in my family born with all of her rights. My sister is 37 years old, right? Because she was born after 1968. And so the government could not discriminate, or private businesses could not discriminate against my sister based upon her race. And she was born in 1982. And so when you think about it in that context, there are a lot of privileges that people have been able to benefit from that other races have not had access to. And then as a society, we're telling people to assimilate. Well, you just need to do X, Y, and Z, right, but not realizing the system that has been set up in place for the last 400 years.
How are the issues similar or different between minorities, example, Asian, Black, Hispanic, etc.? And how can St. Paul's grow as a church in this area of ethnic diversity, redemptive ethnic unity, especially when we don't have a very diverse population? I'd love to speak to this first one because in any of these conversations, inevitably, a question like this surfaces. And what you need to know is, in this country in particular, Black people weren't legally allowed to read for 400 years. That drastically changes the way that the Black race, the African American population, interacts in America than several other minorities. However, because of the 1965 Immigration Act, a flood of minorities came in at that point where there was a decrease in European immigrants and an increase of every other immigrant. And so that being the case, there are very similar issues of being non-majority culture in that acceptance is less likely. But again, there's a sociological gradient even of that. But at the same time, the differences really come down a lot of times to history. I mean, if you walk up to an Asian individual who was not born in this country and ask him, hey, when did you know you were Asian? He would tell you, or she would tell you, when I came to America. Like in Korea, everybody Korean. So, I mean, if you're not, you know. Like in China, everybody's Chinese, and if you're not, you know. But the reality is, in China doesn't work like we do. And so I've talked to friends of mine who are African that are from Ghana. Like, and in Ghana, you were discerned by your tribe. And so they didn't know they was African American till they came here. I mean, they didn't know they was Black till they came over here because they just saw themselves within the culture, the way of life that they lived. And so that said, the grand similarity between all minorities is that they are minorities. The grand difference is historical influences regarding how those minorities are treated based upon when their generations came.
Yeah, and so there was speaking in an American context, there was a case, Plessy versus Ferguson. I think a lot of people will probably know it, but it was the separate but equal, right? That you can have two separate, you can have a whites only and a blacks only, but they could be equal. It wasn't until Brown v. Board of Education, Citikidz 1954, that they then came where it was a unanimous decision where they said separate is inherently unequal. Well, again, if you're thinking about the separate but equal, there was certain levels of assimilation for some minorities where they may have been able to go to certain schools that were not afforded to blacks. And so that is a difference. Where again, there was so it led to an idea of what you may hear like the model minority, where it is not so much, and very often it is seen for Asian Americans, and I can't speak to that context completely because I'm not Asian, but there's a idea that, well, because Asian Americans have assimilated, or we've allowed them to assimilate, well, every other minority should just be like Asians and they wouldn't have problems. But again, it does not give them the same equality under the law that majority culture has. It just gives them a higher standing as a minority. Right. So even within, there are certain issues that minorities face that are not, like, all minorities don't face the same issues, but there are differences as far as how our nation has treated minorities throughout history.
Absolutely. The question, how can St. Paul's grow in in the area of ethnic diversity, especially when we don't have a very diverse population. I think the first thing that needs to be communicated is it doesn't have to be ethnic diversity that you grow in, but whether you like it or not, you will by 2042, or you won't exist. The second part is it's not like no other county around you, right, has minorities. It's just more the reality, or diverse populations. It's just more the reality that where you're focused doesn't have those diverse populations ethnically. But that said, the church should be made up of multi-generational, multicultural as well. Not everybody who looks alike has the same culture. I mean, there are people who are Italian and there are people who are German. They have very different cultures. And so, unfortunately, in America, we just lump them all in white often. And instead of, again, getting that richness, because there is a difference between certain types of flowers and certain types of animals. And certain types of colors that God created. Some of them are combined of two. Some of them are primary colors. And so that said, I really want to push and continue to remind you, it doesn't just have to be that you go create a Black, Asian, Hispanic friend. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying your church needs to go out and find people who are not even in your community to come into it. What we're saying is the church is the people and the vehicle through which God is going to flex. So if you are only having conversations with people who look like you, I'm trying to figure out how you live Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, chapter 7, that says it'll be every tribe, every nation, every language, every tongue. You cannot tell me, maybe you can tell me that you only have been in Somerset, Pennsylvania your entire life. You never go on vacation. You never been out of the state. Again, that's a whole different conversation if that's you. And I'd love to talk to you personally about how we can help, because you need to get out and get different stories. But biblically speaking, you just need to remember when God reconciled you to himself, he reconciled you to others. You can invite churches. You can invite local assemblies with people of different races and ethnicities to your church. Guess what? As a body of believers, you could choose a Sunday and go to their church. Those are the things that we don't often think about, but they're certainly possible.
Yeah. That was great. I was just thinking, and even, as it pertains to Somerset, like being able to advocate for someone that does not look like you.
Right.
Because that very often we're thinking, well, I may not see, it's almost like see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's like, well, there's still a lot of evil out there that you can actively work against. It's the idea of just not being non-racist, but being anti-racist. Again, is like you can actually speak out against something, as opposed to just being completely silent. Because very often that silence is agreement, or can be seen as agreement.
That silence can be seen as agreement. I think that's a great place for us to end today. And we're going to continue to answer your questions. And we're going to, at the very end of this, really postulate three things. And we're trying to do it as we answer the questions. We're going to be talking about past hurts. We're going to be talking about present scars, and we're going to be talking about future glory. And you've heard some of that. The past hurts we're going to be talking about is all of those ways that we've seen systemic racism, particularly to the African-American population. But we're going to talk about it as we have we haven't even talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was a whole law on making sure Asian Chinese people couldn't be in America. There are a lot of things like that.
The internment camps in World War II.
Absolutely. There are whole states that are trying to take slavery out of history books. Because again, the history that is often being taught is not the history of majority culture, and not the history of minority culture, but the history of majority culture. Very rarely do you hear about Native American genocide. What you hear, you hear the term Indian giving, which I know to be you give it to somebody and they take it back. Well, it was the Native Americans' land. We were the ignorant. I say we. There was an ignorance in calling them Indians for where they were. However, all of those stories that get told in history end up getting told from the perspective of the people who want to tell the history because it makes it sound better. It reminds me of Frozen 2.
Yeah, and quick aside to that statement is the Civil War is a beautiful example of that. I don't know if it's a beautiful or bad example, but shortly after the Civil War, there was, for those that don't know how the Civil War happened, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president. He is known to be an abolitionist. The South then gets to a war posture. I think it was in I can't remember the year, but they start to develop a war posture. They then secede from the Union. After they secede from the Union, what happens is they go to war over the issue of slavery. After the South loses, what happens is there's this group called the Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Daughters of the Confederacy were, and again, women didn't have the right to vote back then, but they were the wives of plantation owners and some of the generals of the war. What they do is they start to write books, not write books, but they're funding people to write books about the South. They start putting up monuments that you see today to almost reframe the South and what the war was about. So they made it more about states' rights. They said that they were, they were fighting for states' rights, that it was their history and their culture that they were fighting for, and not the issue of slavery. Although historically that was not the case. And so again, it's the idea of how history has been written in a way that has neutered the actual truth of what happened.
Absolutely, and it benefits those that perpetuated those same racist ideas. We are going to continue this conversation, as I said before, and we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us for Body Talks. We're talking about redemptive ethnic unity. Peace.